So, yeah, look at the root forward. This is a protocol that's been being developed recently for real-time object delivery over unidirectional transport. And by the way, it could also be interesting to combine it with quick. That would be something interesting to look at, which we kind of looked at a little bit. Okay, so what is route? A route, because it's supposed to rhyme with flute. Real-time object delivery over unidirectional transport. There's really three protocols involved. There's a source protocol, which is where you can broadcast, multicast, or potentially even quick source data for objects. There's a repair protocol, which is a broadcast, multicast of repair data for objects generated using erasure code, for example, RaptorQ, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then there's also a third protocol, which is an HTTP repair protocol, and that's used if you don't get the object recovery from these two over the broadcast, multicast, then you can use this to get the remaining bit. So what is the idea behind root? It's based on flute. Flute was designed in the IETF many years ago. I was pretty much involved in that pretty heavily. It's flute, ALC, LCT. It was designed for broadcast, multicast of delivery of large, non-real-time NRT objects. And it definitely does not handle efficiently a real-time stream of smaller objects. It just, the signaling is too heavy and so on. It's also based on Dash. So Dash was really designed for HTTP delivery of real-time stream of smaller objects, but it was definitely not designed for broadcast, multicast delivery. So the idea behind root is to combine the good features of both to provide something where it can not only deliver reliably real-time or non-real-time large objects, but also real-time stream of small objects like Dash content. So where does root take from flute? It takes the broadcast, multicast delivery of objects framework, and it also has the reliability provided by using the RaptorQ erasure codes. What does it take from Dash? Dash is really good because it has all this rule-based signaling of parameters common to objects of a stream. For example, template rules for URIs, timing, and so on. And this is something which you can put into a small kind of manifest file and deliver to the receivers, and you don't have to keep signaling all the time. So it really substantially reduces the streaming, makes it possible to support real-time object stream delivery. So just to kind of get the terminology clear, there's kind of three kind of objects we're talking about. Application objects, which are obviously, these are things that have meaning to an application. For example, an RT file or a Dash segment are considered to be objects. Application objects can also be other things as well. So the source transport object is really something that's internal to root, sorry. A unit of data that root tries to reliably deliver to the receivers. And often it's essentially an application object. It may carry other application parameters as well. It can be a partial application object. So for example, if you're taking a long HLS segment of 10 seconds and you want to deliver it in 2-second segments, you can break it up into smaller transport objects and deliver those in 2-second segments. Or it can be multiple application objects sort of condensed together if you want to deliver a package of application files as one unit. The repair transport object is something that's generated using the RaptorQ encoder from the source transport objects. And this is sent to help the receivers reliably recover the source transport objects because we're talking about a one-way transport here. There's no retransmission or anything else involved. So if individual receivers lose packets, unless there's this repair mechanism, they're out of luck. They're going to be missing parts of they won't get the full transport object delivered unless you have this repair mechanism in place, or if you use the HTTP repair service. That's another way to do it. Okay, so just to give a one-slide overview of how the encoding and decoding works, this is the FEC part, so to speak, for it's an erasure code. And what it does is it takes a source transport object, you employ the RaptorQ encoder to it, and you can generate what I call in this talk a repair transport object, so it's repair stuff. And then you you packetize the original source transport object into root source packets and send those over the source protocol. You can packetize the repair object into root repair packets and send that over the repair protocol. You transmit that whole thing. You may have some loss, so in this case you lost these 2 packets here, but you receive these 2 repair packets. And then you employ the RaptorQ decoder to take whatever you received, and as long as the amount you received is equal to or greater than the size of the original source transport object, you can recover the source transport object reliably, and you recover that at the receiver. Okay. So the RaptorQ codes are specified in IETF RFC 6330. This was from around 2011 or so. Some of the high-level features, it has a low-impact encoding and decoding. In fact, a kind of optimized implementation can encode and decode at gigabits per second. Actually, the encoding and decoding processes are pretty symmetric to each other. And this is on a standard platform for relevant size source transport objects. So if you're streaming at, for example, 10 megabits per second, this is a very small fraction of your CPU for doing the encoding or decoding. And it has great flexibility, so the source transport objects can vary in size from really tiny to really pretty large. And the repair transport object size is incredibly flexible, so you can send as little repair or much repair as you'd like. So the root sender, the application objects come in. You generate the source transport objects from the application objects. Sometimes it's just a one-to-one mapping, sometimes a little more complicated. And you packetize those and you send that over your broadcast multicast network, for example, as root source packets. Then you employ the RaptorQ encoding to generate these repair transport objects from the source transport objects, and use your root repair protocol to generate the root repair packets and send those out. On the receiving side, typically there's sort of 2 kinds of receivers you can consider. For legacy reasons, there may be receivers that actually don't have the FEC encoding capabilities built in, so those are source-only receivers. They can receive the original source packets and try to recreate the original source transport objects based on what's received, and then produce the application objects. If they are fully enabled receivers, they can also join the root repair, take root repair packets that have been sent, combine those 2 to use the RaptorQ decoder, this should be actually up here, to regenerate the source transport objects and then extract the application objects out of that. So some of the protocol concepts used in root, there's something called an ensemble. You can think of this as something like a representation in a dash setting. It's a series or set of related transport objects, so it's a little more general than just a representation, but that's really basically the idea. And associated with those transport objects, there's typically transport object identifiers that are typically in a kind of a nice sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are the first one you send is going to have TOI1, the second TOI2, the third TOI3. And that's because it's a good thing to do, because it makes these rule-based templating that you would get from Dash applicable in this kind of setting. Okay. A transport object is something you send within an ensemble. And the root packets, we've already talked about. That carries the data for transport objects, rather it's the source data or the repair data. So the ensemble parameters, these are the things that are common to all transport objects of an ensemble. It's often a template rule is used here, because what you'd like is a fixed size description per ensemble that has to be gotten by the receiver to understand what kind of objects are going to be delivered within that ensemble. Typically delivered out of band to receivers, similar to an MPD of a dash session. So an example for a source ensemble would be to say, well, everything being sent in this ensemble is a video file. Everything is, and here's how you generate the URI at the receiver for the video files that you receive. So for example, if you receive a source transport object with TOI33, then you take this string here and replace the TOI %05D to 00033, and that gives you the URI for that, and so on. And for example, you can signal things like, well, I'm only going to be sending packets for this source transport object for 2 seconds. So if after you receive the first packet for this source transport object, you should wait at most 2 seconds before you're going to, for sure you're not going to receive any more. And at that point you can recover because you're not going to receive anything more and deliver that to the application object. So this is an example of that. So these are just examples of things you could sort of signal in the ensemble parameters. Transport object parameters, these are things that vary from transport object to transport object. So for example, and there's two types. There's recovery transport objects. These are the things that you use directly to recover the source transport object. These have to be delivered in-band in the packets themselves. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. And this, for example, includes the TOI, the transmission object size, and other things you need to actually recover the source transport objects. Then there's a bunch of other stuff which you don't necessarily need to recover the source transport object, but you would want to deliver to the application other parameters. So for example, these are used to form, identify, provide information about other application objects. And these are typically delivered in-band. I'll talk about two versions of root 1.0 and 2.0. And 2.0, these are delivered as the trailer in a source transport object. And examples of these kind of parameters include the exact size of the application object data carried in the source transport object, a start byte offset into the application object in case the source transport object is only a partial port of an application object, the URI in case it's not being generated according to a template, the playback duration of it in case it's, for example, a video file or part of a video file, and so on. So these are things you don't need to use to recover the actual source transport object, but you definitely want to deliver this stuff to the application because it's very useful for it to be able to use that to know what to do with the data you're delivering. So the history of root is the first version was developed by ATSC, developed in document number A-331, commonly called ATSC 3.0. This IETF root draft is in preparation, describes the overall principles of root. There's a description of root 1.0, which is based on and compatible with the A-3331 document. And there's also a root 2.0, which is based on root 1, but it's further simplified and cleaned up. It has lighter weight and expanded features. And this may be the basis for further standardization work, for example, in DVB or other standards, and so on. So this is still obviously a work in progress, but it's come a fair amount of way. I guess I should have also said that the original flute-based stuff was also adopted into 3GPP MBMS, and that actually is deployed in some places around the world. That's kind of not the root version. The root is the stuff where you add the dash and so on to make it better. So the root 2.0, let me explain a little bit more about how that works. It borrows concepts from the HTT entity mode in a kind of conceptual way. So the entity mode has an entity body which carries the data, and it has a header which carries the parameters describing the data. By analogy, the source transport object for root 2.0 is similar. There's a source transport body which carries the application object data, and then it has a trailer on it which carries all the delivery transport object parameters. So it breaks it up in the same way. And so here's a picture of that. So here you have the body of the source transport object which carries the application object data. You have a trailer which carries the parameters for delivery of the application object to the application. And just as an example, the last two fields of the trailer are the size of the trailer in bytes. So you need to know that to know how long that trailer is at the end. And the size of the body in bytes, which is the amount of application data that the source transport object carries. And then you can put a lot of other fields into this trailer. For example, the URIs and byte offsets and all kinds of other stuff. All right. So here's a source transport object packet header for 2.0. It has an ensemble ID. It has a transport object ID. It has a payload ID, which identifies which part of the transport object is carried in this packet. And it has a transport object size, which says what's the total size of the source transport object you're carrying. Okay, and it's 12 bytes in total, so it's not very big. So the payload ID is a start byte offset into the data of the source transport object carried in the packet payload. So it's very simple. It's HTTP-like. It's just a byte offset, right? Very, very simple kind of way to do that. And the object size is a compact representation of the size of the source transport object, which includes the body, trailer, and possible padding bytes. So that's the total size of the source transport object size. The repair transport object packet header, I don't know if you noticed that, but if you go between this slide and this slide, there's almost no difference. So the repair packet transport header is almost the same, has the same ensemble ID, transport object ID, payload ID, and transport object size. Now, it can have more than one transport object size depending on how many source transport objects it's protecting. In this case, it's protecting one, so it only has one. So the packet format is exactly the same. The payload ID is similar, but it's a start byte offset into the data of the repair transport object, not in the source transport object. So it says which byte of repair are you starting with in this packet payload. And then the transport object size is the size of the source transport object that's being protected by this repair transport object. So that's what a very simple, very similar format for the, actually identical for the source and repair with slightly different meanings. So here's an example just to kind of see what's going on. So let's suppose this is a streaming example. So this is, for example, when you wanted to deliver a dash stream using root, which is one of the things it's designed to do. So you might have one source ensemble of video, which is really corresponds to a dash representation. It has an ensemble ID 1, and it has some ensemble parameters saying it's a source ensemble, it's video, and here's how you generate the URIs for that, each segment in that video stream. And then you might have a corresponding audio ensemble, which has ensemble ID 2, and it has parameters that are corresponding to audio and a way to generate the URI for it and so on. And then you have a corresponding repair ensemble to protect the video and audio together as a bundle. So it has an ensemble ID 3, and its parameters say, I'm repair, I'm protecting 2 streams, and here are the ensemble IDs of the streams that I'm protecting, 1 and 2. So here's a visualization of that. So you can view this as video ensemble. This is the dash representation for video streaming down here. Here it is for audio. These have corresponding TOIs, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And for each one, you have this repair object that's being generated over here by applying the Raptor Q to the combination of these 2 guys to generate this repair data, and you're transmitting that. And so that's how this process would work. So on the receiving side, you would take this together with whatever you receive from these 2, and if you received enough, to which enough is the total size of this, use the Raptor Q decoder to recover both the video and the audio object together. Okay. Now I just wanted to give, this is one of my favorite examples for an NRT file example. Interestingly enough here, we have an NRT file, say 100 megabytes. We formed the source transport object, but in this example, we're not going to actually send any source packets. We're only going to use the Raptor Q encoding to generate repair transport object and send only repair packets. And the reason for doing it this way is because it makes if you use this in combination with an HTTP repair service, it makes it much more efficient from a caching kind of perspective. So imagine that you had this NRT file, you sent out maybe 110 megabytes of repair data, but the receivers have lost, so this receiver only received 85 megabytes. The blue one is the broadcast, how much they received of that. This one received 90. So all these receivers were in bad conditions. They didn't receive at least 100. All the other receivers that received at least 100 megabytes of repair, they can regenerate the object on their own. They don't need to do any of the HTTP request. But this guy only got 85, so he's missing 15. So he can go and request 15 megabytes of packets from this HTTP server. And this guy got 90, he can request 10. This guy received 70, he requests 30, and so on. But the nice thing about this thing is that since they only received repair, none of the source, if they ask for a prefix of this NRT file, so this guy asked for a prefix of 15 megabytes, this guy for a prefix of 10, this for 30 and 5, that's all they need to recover the file. And so actually all the requests are starting from the beginning of the file, and there's some prefix of it, so it's really nice caching and delivery kind of characteristics based on that. And I see I'm literally got 12 seconds left. So last thing I want to say, look at my route forward. This is my last few days at Qualcomm. I'm moving on. So if anybody wants to know what I'm going to be doing next, this is my email. And thanks. So I've really appreciated all the time I've spent.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Are there any questions in the audience? Okay.
So what kind of FEC rates are they planning to use in ATSC? I'm just curious.
What kind of?
FEC rates, like what's for 100 megabyte of file or like a media video file, whatever?
To be honest, I don't think they know at this point. It's too early.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they just finished the standard. There's really, there hasn't been deployed. So it might be more interesting to ask that in the MBMS context, which I still don't know the answer to.
Okay.
But at least they have deployed it and used it. Yeah.
Glenn, do you know the answer to that question?
There are LDCP codes. I can't tell you the exact rate. I don't know.
Okay.
Just not sure.
All right. Any other questions?
So you mentioned use of root together with HTTP. Is there any protocol or any well-defined way of switching on demand from an HTTP unicast into a root multicast?
So I know we've worked on that a lot. That's probably a better question for Thomas if he's here.
I'm hiding.
Excuse me?
I'm hiding.
You're hiding.
Well, the protocol itself, it's more an operation. It's not an issue of the protocol. It's really an operation, right? So you can do this. That's what Flute does this in 3GPP.
Yeah.
So you can do the same basically with root. There is nothing preventing this. But you would need a management layer on top of this, which does this, like the 3GPP switching, mood switching, and so on and so on. So that is basically orthogonal to the protocols. But I don't see anything that would prevent this.
Yeah, I know in the back end we worked on it a lot, but I don't know exactly what went on in the actual standards.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.